So I would like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. We would like to open today's webinar by acknowledging the land that we are gathered on and expressing our gratitude for its critical connection to the health of all. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and resilience of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people on this land, and we recognize their role as caregivers, stewards, and storytellers across Turtle Island. We believe that parks play a vital role in providing shared spaces for all people and are an important space for reconciliation and decolonization. In the context of today's discussion, it feels especially important to recognize the legacy of Indigenous displacement that has led to the creation of many urban parks and public spaces. In addition, the historical role of urban planning in settler colonialization and dispossession. As we discuss engagement within the context of parks and public spaces and our roles as city builders, it is important to reflect on the impact and implications of these discussions. It is our responsibility to guide and implement practices and policies that uphold and restore Indigenous relationships to the land. We hope that this land acknowledgement invites us all to reflect on the ongoing colonial injustices in our park systems and brings that awareness to our conversation today. You will also see that we on the panel are honoring Orange Shirt Day today. Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, is a day where we honor the Indigenous children who were sent away to residential schools in Canada and learn more about the history of these schools. The people who put on this day have chosen the day September 30th because it falls during the time of year when Indigenous children were taken away to residential schools. And it is an opportunity for First Nations, local governments, schools, and communities to come together in the spirit of reconciliation and hope for the generations of children to come. Today is a day for us to honor and remember those that were forced away from their families and forced to go through the residential school system. It is important for us to continue to seek out and listen to these stories and to make acknowledgements in order to continue our work towards truth and reconciliation in Canada. We invite you now to introduce yourself in the chat window with your name, organization, and what nation's territory you're visiting from. If you don't know which nation's territory you live or work in, we do encourage you to visit nativeland.ca or Whose Land, which we've also linked in the chat window. For those who are joining Park People with a webinar with Park People for the first time, a really quick note of introduction. Our work focuses on helping people to activate the power of parks and improve the quality of life in cities across Canada. Our national network program provides comprehensive support to grassroots community groups, nonprofit organizations, and municipal staff across the country that are working to animate and enhance their local parks. This webinar series is made possible by the generous support of the TD Ready Commitment Fund, as well as the Metcalf Foundation. We are very grateful for their support, and we would also like to thank all of our individual donors who support our continued work and efforts. So turning it to our panelists, I am really happy to be joined today by four incredible people who work in engagement in Canada. They have fantastic and slightly longer biographies, so I will have them posted in the chat window. But we've got Cheryll Case, who is the founder and principal of CP Planning and working with the City of Brampton. We've got Jennifer Franks, who is the Indigenous Placemaking Lead for the City of Toronto. Sophia Horwitz, who is partner and co-founder of COLAB. And Mikael St. Pierre, who is Project and Development Manager at the Montreal Urban Ecology Center. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you so much for being with us today. I wanted to just kind of start things off with a few unique questions. So first of all, looking to Jennifer, your research and past work has really explored the connection between Indigenous people and their connection to place, and specifically parks. Can you speak a little bit about your role as lead of Indigenous placemaking for the City of Toronto's Indigenous Affairs Office, kind of what that is, what that looks like, and what makes Indigenous placemaking unique?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Molly. I'm very happy to be here. So I guess I'll just start by saying that placemaking in the territory that we now call Toronto has, of course, been taking place for millennia. But in a contemporary sense, in the last several years, even before our office was created in 2018, there have been many placemaking activities, projects, and initiatives, many of which have occurred irrespective of city government. So this is evidenced particularly in public art installations, murals, and other naming initiatives. So In 2017, the city's Parks and Environment Committee directed staff to develop a placemaking strategy. And since then, the placemaking work at the city has encompassed a range of areas, so including public art, naming, land-based access and programming, land stewardship, integrating Indigenous design principles into space making and building capacity within our own city organization with city colleagues and agency colleagues to help understand and better appreciate the Indigenous history of this territory, and we call it truth telling. So when I talk about Indigenous placemaking, we kind of frame it in a variety of ways. I'll just highlight three of them. One is improving the visibility of Indigenous people, history, and the current vibrant culture in Toronto. So that would mean, honoring the ancestral and territorial rights holders of this territory, but also recognizing the very vibrant contemporary Indigenous landscape of the city. There's approximately 80,000 self-identified Indigenous people that live in Toronto. And they come from all over Turtle Island, nations across Canada and the US, and what we call Turtle Island, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So recognizing that, that very diverse landscape. We want to decolonize and indigenize public space, including parks, and you kind of noted that a little bit in your intro, and exploring better ways to share space with Indigenous people, Indigenous communities, and tell the truth of the land and water in this territory. A lot of people aren't aware of that many places that they visit or pass through every day have extremely significant extreme significance for the people who are the original land stewards of this territory. So I'm not sure how much time I have. I can speak to a little bit more about this, or I'm not sure how much time I have. I can talk a little bit about how we're doing this, or
yeah, why don't we, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you're going about
okay.
that.
Sorry, I wasn't sure how much time we had to answer.
Okay.
I'm mindful of everyone's time.
No.
So we're doing this in a number of ways. We're working closely with Indigenous partners and community. When we talk about engagement, I know that's a separate question, so I can talk more about the engagement piece when we get to that separate question, but it's a huge part of it is engaging in a meaningful and good way, engaging early on. So there's a phrase that's used quite a lot. It's nothing about us without us. So it's focusing on co-development and really thinking about what is the purpose of the engagement, and how is this initiative going to improve the lives of Indigenous people in the city? Leveraging and building upon existing policies, programs, and partnerships. So, there's a lot of existing policy levers that we can take advantage of, that have already been approved, where there's money. So leveraging those initiatives, but also developing new ones. Taking a really deep look at our own practices, views, and approaches. So our own biases, our social position, and this is part of our cultural capacity building work that we're doing internally with our colleagues, is taking a step back and how do we engage in a good way? What are some of our biases? How do we perceive space differently than Indigenous people? You mentioned it in your intro, Molly, about parks being kind of inherently colonial spaces. There's circumscribed spaces, there's prescribed rules, there's a certain amount of landscaping in some parks where people aren't allowed to walk. And the very nature of that is very antithetical to a certain extent with how Indigenous people move in the world and relate to land. And then finally, decolonizing the way we do things. So taking a look at some of our rules, bylaws, policies, what are the barriers that are in place in some of those processes, and how can we make those changes in a good way to remove those barriers, and that's all connected with engaging early on, right? We don't do this in a vacuum. We need to talk directly with Indigenous community and people in order to know how to decolonize. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. That's fascinating. So I'd like to loop in Sophia here. So Sophia, you work you're based out of what's known as Halifax, correct?
The unceded, unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq. Yeah.
Yeah. And we would like, I just would love to hear a little bit about kind of your work, and if you could speak a little bit to some of the shifts or trends that you've seen in engagement over the last 6 months, and maybe give a little bit of insight into what's happening or what's unique to the East Coast.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's such a big question because there's so much and difference across the different provinces here. But like, I guess that when I first thought of that question, one of my first responses was like, what has been happening? Like there's been things happening, but actually I'm quite worried that things are happening too quickly and without much public input. And it's like more important than ever that we engage in what's going on and know about it and have control over the ways that our communities are shifting. But it feels like in the rush to move things ahead or to move things back to business as normal, it's like the whole recovery plan happened without much engagement.
Yeah.
Public space was very limited here in Nova Scotia. There was, the lockdown was pretty severe, and there was a lot of fear and shaming and policing happening in all across our communities. And so even basic walking across a park to get from A to B that is, a way to go just became a potential place to get a ticket. And these kind of things not only affected our mental health and our well-being, but just the ways that we understand and imagine how our city is and who it's for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe I'll just build off of that a little bit, and I'll open this up to everyone. I think there was this sense that, well, Sophia, you kind of spoke to a little bit. It's almost that we're short on time. We've got to come up with a plan. We're just going to go ahead and make something happen. And then the other side of it is that there was this sense, I think at some point, in the last 6 months, that maybe COVID was the catalyst for change or the kick in the pants that we were waiting for. Has that change happened? Are we seeing active change in engagement and in our parks and public spaces?
I would say the rhetoric that took place doesn't match up to the action that took place. The idea of there being this massive change, there hasn't quite been as much change as was, I guess, promoted as an opportunity, and it's been over 6 months now. And so, for just as one example, I feel like this is just something that I believe is a general truth, is that many of the solutions that we talk about have been solutions that have been put forward by folks for generations, right? And talking about being able to farm locally, for example, have local farming and urban farming, and having diverse agriculture. The Indigenous communities having their lands taken from them and no longer being able to fish on their lands because of the development process that came about from the settlers. There's always been resistance to this quite harmful relationship that we now have with land, and so the systems that keep those structures in place have they maybe have had some conversations about, okay, how do we pivot to a more healthy relationship with land, but we're still seeing for example, public spaces where folks who are homeless are having to live in tent camps, being evicted from those tent camps because the system is prioritizing the other values rather than having those folks housed and resourcing those folks, and then also to develop the housing as well, and to make those spaces safe for folks. And another thing too is like the park people and the Toronto Alliance on the Environment. They recently started a push on looking for food share, and the Toronto Alliance on the Environment have recently started pushing for the golf courses in Toronto to be turned into urban farms. Right, these two organizations have been pushing for quite some time for more urban farms in the city. And we're now coming to the end of the regular growing season, and we haven't really seen the number of urban farms actually increase in the neighborhood, despite the cost of food going up, the amount of unemployment going up, and the underlying need that always existed for us to make better use of our land.
Thanks for that, Cheryl. Does anyone else have anything else to add on that?
Well, perhaps we've been reflecting on this. Well, obviously, the pandemic is unfortunate for everyone, but we identified at Montreal Urban Ecology Center some opportunities for change, whether it's about parks, but also at the more global scale in public spaces in general. At least here in Quebec, and I know pretty much everywhere in the world, there were some transitory transformations that were done to better suit, to make sure that public space better enters all those issues that the pandemic gives us. And one key that we identified, and we tried to make some promotion out of it in Quebec, is the gathering data, to make sure that municipalities and communities gather data, whether it's, well, obviously before, during, and after any kind of intervention, to kind of build a case over why it's important to do some transformation of built environment. And we've all seen those issues coming up, whether it's about transformation of streets or public spaces. Whenever you take something away from someone, they're going to be screaming a little bit louder than others. So we made this whole case about how can we develop some tools and develop that reflex for professionals and for elected officials in every community, to make sure that they gather data and they better understand the impact of transforming this environment. So this was a key that we actually identified a couple of months ago. And unfortunately, we did not see that much change over that issue. Yeah, we were transforming. There were some different redesign that were made for the summer, but there wasn't much willingness to better evaluate and to better understand the impact. And to us, it's actually an issue, because whenever we talk about changing at the long term and transforming our cities, if we're not able to build a case and show how it could be beneficial, then we won't be able to change that paradigm, if I could say.
So that's almost thinking about making the case for change and having that data to back you up. So I think that kind of loops into an interesting, I think, assumption that's a big part of the engagement narrative right now, and I'd love to tap into that a little bit. So it seems to me that there seems to be this assumption that the future of engagement is digital. Along those same lines, we're also seeing a revert back to analog. So, greater emphasis on bulletin board notices and mailouts, word of mouth, that kind of thing. So just, kind of a general question, like, is digital the future, or are we actually moving to more analog methods of engagement?
Perhaps since I spoke last, I'll speak first this time.
Okay.
Maybe to better answer that question, I'd like to present the Montreal Urban Ecology Center, who we are. We're a non-governmental organization. We're going to be celebrating 25 years next year, actually. And over the course of our history, our mission has always been to contribute to creating ecological, democratic, and healthy cities. Mm-hmm. We work in Montreal, we work in Quebec, and we have partnerships across the country, and even a strategic partnership across the globe. And over the course of our 25 years, we developed different types of practices. And we're a bunch of nerds. We're a bunch of participatory and urban planning nerds, obviously. And we reflected about that. Obviously, there are some opportunities that we're seeing right now. We've all been on Zoom and everything else for the past six months, and we've seen some benefits of this. But we need to be cautious. We need to be cautious because processes are not as satisfactory when they are full on, totally digital. than if they are, as you said, analog, or if we try to create some kind of hybrid. There's an opportunity here, obviously, to, as I said, develop some hybrid models of engagement where we're able to connect with a variety and lots of people easily through digital modes. But we also keep in mind that field activities need to be held, and that we need to be sure that we have satisfactory processes. And when I talk about satisfactory processes, it's for the participants to make sure that they have a feeling that their voices are heard, but also about the inputs that we receive to make sure that it goes to the ends and it has an impact on decision making. We all witnessed the limits of digital. We've all been in that meeting where, you know, internet's breaking up. We see the cat coming on the table, and, you know, the flow of the discussion is not the same. And obviously, those limits, they will obviously be affecting the processes in general. And there's also an issue that's truly important, is digital engagement is one further roadblock, if I could say, for some population that are not necessarily, it's not as easy for them to use technology, to use Zoom, to use, I don't know, Google, SurveyMonkey or whatever, as it is for them to go to the library and answer a survey, or go to the town hall meeting and talk with, you know, engage in a more natural way. So what we try to reflect on, and what we try to kind of sensibilize the partners and communities we work with, is that there's an opportunity, once we're done with this pandemic, knocking on wood, to kind of create some hybrid methods where we'll be able to inform, to validate, to gather some preliminary data through digital means. Something that's obviously super is that we're able to easily, quickly connect with people, have some one-on-one discussions, obviously to disseminate some surveys easily, but also to make sure that if we want to develop a vision, if we want to negotiate, to take decisions, that there's no better way than being in person. And whenever we'll be done with this whole pandemic thing, hopefully we'll be keeping some of the best that we learned through this digital engagement, but we'll keep going what we know better, and that's in person, in the field engagement and participation process.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I don't have an answer, but I just wanted to offer some thoughts and reflections on the nature of digital engagement, particularly in the last few months. So in the context of engaging with Indigenous communities and Indigenous people, it is a challenge because so much of engaging with community is about being on the land and being in place and space. And so it is challenging, particularly in a placemaking kind of context where we're talking about, you know, a land-based project. When you're sitting at your kitchen table, you know, it's so much of the conversation needs to kind of take place in the space that you're talking about. So that's a challenge, but also a lot of Indigenous engagement, depending on the nation, there's cultural protocols that are, you know, about being physically in the same space as others in a circle. You know, there's offering tobacco, there's burning medicines, and, you know, smudging, you know, in advance of the meeting. So we've tried to do some of those things virtually, depending on the group, and, you know, it is an acknowledgement of protocol and ceremony, but it's definitely not the same. So you know, I don't have an answer for it. We're just kind of like figuring out as we go along. We have had smaller group sessions outside. Obviously in the summer and early fall, it's a lot easier to do that, physically distance. But as far as sort of large engagement, you know, it's not ideal for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So
not a solution, but just a comment.
No, thank you for that. Cheryl, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely, you know, we can't really have these large public setted meetings. And so that requires us to, when we're having those more personal conversations, working more directly with, people who we might identify as community leaders, and counting on them to represent their communities well, and ensuring that they do have the community's interest at best heart, that they are in conversation with their folks, and essentially working through networks. And so instead of having a large public forum, you'll have to have those more intimate conversations, and then perhaps have those more community conversations through Zoom settings. So it's about mixing these two, I guess, strategies. Yeah.
Is there a time or a place or a project, and maybe I'm just trying to break it down a little bit here, where digital would be more appropriate or in person would be more appropriate?
I thought I would, yeah, like I feel like digital is for sure one tool in the toolbox, as many of you have said, and it's like, we've had it actually for a long time. It's nothing new. People are relying on it more. I'm worried that it can be the excuse and de facto where people are like, oh, there's this cheaper, easier version, we can go online. But it, as so many of you have already mentioned, it's missing so much of the community connection, relationship, idea development, world. There's just so much else that's going to be lost. The informal body language and everything else. And I feel like it can quickly become much more transactional when we move solely online. And so to me, it's like always like, where do we meet people where they're at? When, I think especially in large areas, like when we're doing an engagement across Nova Scotia, let's definitely think about how we can use some online aspects, but also when can we hire local leaders to be doing engagement with their own communities themselves, and working in that network approach, much like you were kind of speaking to, Cheryl, of like, when do we go to community leaders, and less about us trying to do it all ourselves, which just never feels possible really. And this kind of just further highlights that we have to be using many different streams, and maybe even a lot of drop-in kind of centers and storefronts in people's neighborhoods embedded, or waiting at parks or different places where people might be hanging out. And
I think that you, when you said meeting people where they are, that to me speaks to a personalized approach. It's not a one size fits all checkbox type of engagement, right? So this engagement piece that I think forever was one of 10 tasks in a list of a project is now, and maybe this is my question, is, are we realizing that it's a much bigger task, because it can't be something that can be done surface level, and so is that a realization out of this time that we're having here, or has that always been around?
You're leaving us speechless with your question.
Not what I'm going for.
I don't think it's, I think that it's always been around, particularly in the nature of the work that I do and engaging with Indigenous communities. I don't think that it's anything new. I think COVID has definitely highlighted, as you said earlier, Molly, kind of gives a kick in the pants, but it's highlighted really the need for access to space and being able to do that in a good way. I think has been a lot of rushed processes because decisions have had to be made very quickly in the last few months with sort of adapting and responding to the pandemic. But I think on a longer term, it is an opportunity to kind of, to look at how we do things. I think, in our context with engaging with Indigenous communities, and I think, it could be indicative of some good practices in engaging just generally about making it meaningful and engaging early and being really thoughtful and purposeful about what you're doing and why. And I noticed one of the questions in the Q&A was about kind of consultation fatigue and ensuring that doesn't happen. So being, coordinating as much as possible and trying to understand or get a sense of, you know, who already has been consulted, and bringing people on early as partners as opposed to tick the box after the fact. And that takes time. You know, for myself, working in a government context, you know, we have a lot of artificial timelines that are placed on us, whether it's a statutory timeline in the Planning Act, you know, our planning colleagues who are engaging, or you know, council has asked us to report back by a certain time, and that's a challenge. So that's part of our work too, is trying to work from within to change some of the way that we do these things, so that we can have a longer, more meaningful and more purposeful engagement and conversation with people.
Absolutely. So building on that a little bit, could we chat a little bit about specific, maybe not specific, but techniques or tools or methods that we can leverage for community or public engagement during COVID? And then I want to chat about kind of the future a little bit after that. But thinking right now, the place and space that we are, what do we have to take into account? What do we need to be leveraging? How do we go about this?
Well, I've been using quite a number of different, I guess, communication platforms. So WhatsApp, for example, I have a WhatsApp group for different communities that I'm engaged with for different policy areas. We exchange information there. There are also email lists where we also exchange information. You know, engaging in phone calls at times, and then also being in person. So it's really about using the diversity of communication approaches and to allow for the conversation to continue. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I think we need to be creative and adapt what we already know works, and not try to overkill it, if I could say. And obviously to be okay whenever there's mistakes, because, well, that happens, and sometimes it's not everyone that's keen on technology. There might be two examples I'd want to say. We sometimes use a fishbowl technique to spark discussions and spark exchange between people. And if you don't know fishbowl, basically you have people that are designated to talk around a circle of people listening. And whenever you want, if you're listening, you can get up, go in the middle, and someone in the middle has to go back and listen. It's actually, I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with this. Well, we tried doing this in a virtual way to spark some discussions between different stakeholders for the development of a program, of a policy in Montreal. So we did this, but we did this with Zoom, and we asked people to open and to close camera. So opening camera meant taking, being able to speak, being in the middle of the circle, and closing camera meant you're in the outside of the circle and you're listening. And whenever someone opened the camera, someone else had to close it. Well, as I said, it's being creative. It's super easy, but we wanted to adapt this. We also did some co-design workshops. We did them online. Instead of having, I don't know, smaller groups of 6, 8 people, we had even smaller breakout groups. We had more mediators. We kind of worked around what we usually do. Obviously, no post-its and no maps to doodle on. So it was more on we were working on the interface of the screen. And in both cases, obviously, as I was saying earlier, it was not as satisfactory as it would have been if we would have been in the same room, but at least we were able to get some quality input towards helping decision making in the end. So and something else, actually, I'd want to say, we experimented with video capsules, actually, to better disseminate information whenever there's a process, there's some information that we want people to be aware of. And with COVID, it's obviously harder to do some public hall meeting. So we started proposing to partners to shoot some video capsules, short video capsules, talk about projects, talk about whatever, a vision or something they had, something that they want to start a process on. And even on smaller programs, we started working with video capsules, and it's actually something that's working well, that wasn't really being done before. So that's some of the ways that we kind of adapted without reinventing the wheel.
Thank you, Mikael. Sophia or Jennifer, either of you want to contribute anything?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I like what you're saying, Mikael. I think a big part for me is not, pretending it's the same thing to do in person versus online. And so I think when people sometimes try and translate them, that's part of the problem, is doing, a multi-hour in-person event or a day-long looks very different. We have to really change the whole thing. And it might look like a number of series of events and a number of formats. But one of the things like I'm thinking about a lot all the time before this and now is like, who's interpreting the data and the information and the stories, and how are people that are part of those stories actually shaping the sense making and the nitty gritty of the messages, making sure that those don't get lost, because that's where a lot of our bias actually lies. And yeah, and then thinking about the online, I just heard of a neat example of someone doing something kind of like you're suggesting, Mikael, where they had on social media like a challenge for people to go to the public space and do an activity that they wanted to be able to do in the space in the future. And so everyone was uploading different videos of the kinds of things they wanted to be able to do there, and just that ability that we can be using, working with residents to actually shape things in a different way. Yeah.
Jennifer, any final thoughts on this one?
I mean, we've tried to use, as been noted by other panelists, different tools in the toolbox. I mean, obviously digital is the common, Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings, particularly with larger groups. One of the things that our office has worked to facilitate with community over the past few months is access to space outside, access to green space, park space, to be able to continue to run critically important programs that they haven't been able to do since the lockdown, since COVID. So, I mean, that's not really engagement necessarily, but it is working with community to be a little creative. We've done some work on city property to basically create sort of fenced in semi-private areas for some of our community organizations to be able to run some fairly sensitive programs for their clients. So I think, so we have been trying to adapt and adjust in that way, but I think as much as possible, particularly in our work, which is very land-based, depending on the size of the group and the site, we do try to go and meet in the space as much as possible. But obviously, I'm talking about a smaller engagement. I'm not talking about a larger scale, community meeting or anything like that. That's still very digital. And yeah, so it depends on the nature of the engagement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so why don't we pull out a few questions here from our Q&A. So we can switch over to the Q&A. I might come back around for one final question before we sign off here. But I did want to see if there was any questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask our panelists, just hover your mouse over the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we're opening up the floor. So I will pass it over to Clemence, who's going to manage the Q&A session, and then she'll pass it back to me. Hey, Clemence.
Hey.
Take it away.
Hi everyone. So yes, there are a few questions for the Q&A. Let me just check which one to go first with. I'm sorry. So, and people are adding more. So yeah, I think the first one, I think Jennifer, you were mentioning it at the beginning, so I'm going to read it out loud for everyone. So on the West Coast, there are a number of First Nations that are quite small. And these First Nations are inundated with requests for engagement, but they often do not have the resources to attend. So how do we show respect and engage under these circumstances?
Yeah, I think that's a very, it's a very good question. And it's something that we address quite a lot in our office. Placemaking and working with Indigenous communities is thankfully becoming more and more top of mind, but it also means that there's a lot of demands placed on community organizations and Indigenous people to share their knowledge and share their thoughts, and oftentimes without any compensation. So I have lots of different suggestions. I mean, I think there's the whole conversation around being really purposeful about why you're engaging, and being able to articulate that clearly, so no one wants to feel that their time is being wasted or that they're just a checkbox. I would also say canvass the community and other staff if you work in a municipal context, for example, to ensure that this kind of work isn't already being done, because I know at the City of Toronto, it's a huge organization. Sometimes there's multiple requests for engagement from different divisions to the same people. So better coordination internally. It's really important to state how your work will benefit the community, the Indigenous community, and not just benefit your own project. And I think really practically, pay people if you can. Provide some way of compensating people for their time and their labor and their knowledge. Part of our work is establishing an advisory circle for Indigenous community to advise on Indigenous placemaking activities and initiatives. So there's a terms of reference, and it's a bit of a structure. And as part of that, we'll be compensating people for their time. And I think that's been a huge issue. People just don't have the resources to be able to help, and it's also just a respect thing as well. They're not being paid, and so practically speaking, even if you can't pay people but provide some kind of a gift, or pay for their transportation or childcare, or some other practical way to compensate them.
So I agree very much with Jennifer about needing to compensate those that we engage. Like many of these folks, they have full lives that they live outside of, doing essentially this advocacy work to see change made. And so being able to compensate them for their time, for their emotional labor of investing in this, is really, really critical. I think, we pay consultants great amounts of money to do this work. We should also pay community members, as they are also, the consultants as well. They're providing us consultation on what is the appropriate way of using this public space.
Nice. I would just add one more thing about this, that is also the transparency of the whole process. That I think one of the ways that often we lose a lot of trust and momentum and is when a process actually isn't clear about what's the clay on the table. And so just being really upfront with what the non-negotiables are and what people can actually affect change. Much like what you were saying, Jennifer, like what people are actually going to get to benefit from something. Yeah.
And I one final comment on this, and it kind of follows through on Sophia's comment, is being really honest about the scope and transparent, but also circling back on closing the loop, not just going out for a meeting or a series of meetings and then everything kind of goes into a black hole and people don't know what came of the engagement, what was the outcome. That happens so much. And so it's really important to close that loop and make people feel that they've contributed in a meaningful way. And if for some reason your project or initiative or whatever it is, things happen, has ended, funding's been pulled, whatever, let people know and just be really honest and transparent about it, so they want to feel acknowledged. So that's just a final comment on that.
Clémence, you're on mute.
So sorry. I'm trying to be on mute just in case my cat would mew during someone answering, so very sorry. Yes, so let me go back. There is a question that is quite different from the others, and I think Cheryl, you may be able to answer that one, but everyone can answer it too. It's about, you were mentioning the use of the lands and transform them into urban parks, and people are wondering also, so someone was asking, with all the chemicals traditionally used in parks, fertilizers, and weed killers, it would be really safe to turn these lands into urban farms.
They're asking if it would be safe?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, the city of Toronto, for example, has remediated industrial lands on its waterfront and renaturalized those lands. So it's very possible to also rehabilitate, the parks is also, you can also have raised beds. So instead of growing directly onto the land itself, you can grow on raised beds instead as an option.
Thank you.
I just also wanted to add that in Toronto, there's some community-based land stewardship organizations, Indigenous land stewardship organizations that are working with city and particularly our Parks and Forestry division to, particularly in High Park, which for people who aren't familiar with Toronto is a very large urban park, they kind of act as monitors. So for just, with brush clearing or pesticide, like encouraging natural ways of managing pesticides, herbicides, and also with controlled burning as well. So there's some partnerships being built between community and city divisions on that. So there are some interesting opportunities for that type of work to restore and naturalize, and then just sort of a more natural, less chemical way of managing these spaces.
Thank you. So someone asked a question that is very interesting about how to reach public. The question came in both languages, so in French and in English. So I'm going to try to put it together. How to reach people in like public space users, especially during COVID, while they are not going into the public space. I know we mentioned the digital way, but is there how do you make sure that people who love a park, a specific park, are going to be the ones that are going to answer the questions, and if you need them to talk about the development of said parks?
Yeah, so one really useful or successful way of doing engagement is to do intercept interviews. So that's where you literally just hang out at a spot and wait for people to come to you, or wait for them to visit the space, and then you ask them like, hey, would you mind answering some questions for me? And I feel like this informal approach really helps to diversify those people who are involved. So instead of getting the super keen people who see the posting, or even are living a lifestyle where they're able to see the posting, and then they attend these meetings, instead of just having their feedback, you're having the feedback about a wide variety of folks who otherwise would not have participated. So intercept interviews, like hanging out in a park and asking them questions as they walk by with their permission, is a great way to achieve that goal.
Awesome. I was going to suggest something pretty similar. So I don't think I have much to add other than even things, Molly, you'd mentioned around mailouts and big community boards and questions in the public spaces themselves, or art installations that kind of grab people's attention to think about something in a different way, and can be low commitment for people to pass by and give some feedback on a bulletin board or chalkboards or other ways. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I'm just going to do one more question from our side of things, and then we're going to wrap up on time here. But just before we sign off, first of all, thank you very much to our panelists and to all of our audience members for joining us today. Before we leave, if there's one thing that we could have our audience members or experts in engagement take away from this conversation, or one thing that you really, really want to impress around, okay, if we want to recreate or reimagine the future of engagement, what's a key thing to bring forward, or to action on, or to reflect on?
I think one thing that I think is important to reflect on, to act on, is to honor that these conversations around the best practices for these land uses have existed, again, for generations. And so instead of thinking about if we're going to be doing these things, and if we're going to be enabling the land to to be healthier, to have healthier relationships with land, we should be focusing on how, right? Like, so how are we going to be doing this? And so when you're engaging with these community groups, you're going to be talking about, okay, how do we get to this outcome in a way that dignifies folks and also empowers them in terms of, like, you know, building their capacity to see themselves in these spaces.
Thank you, Cheryl.
There was one interesting question in the questions, and the question you're asking actually gives me the opportunity to answer another question. Someone was asking, what is bad engagement? And what I would want to answer to your question, Molly, is that to make sure that you give people real power. I was talking earlier about satisfactory engagement, and obviously if decisions are already taken, or we're talking about superficial decisions that need to be taken, and we're going to leave that to the citizens in participation. It's not something satisfactory, and that's one of the reasons why people are not coming back and are not further participating in other processes. So to make sure that if ever there's a willingness to give some power and decision making to people, that to put forward some satisfying processes, and I would be super unhappy without talking about participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is a process of giving power to people by making sure that there's a percentage of the yearly budget of the city or the community going towards direct decision making by residents. And in 2018, we did some PB, participatory budgeting, in parks in Montreal, and it was super successful. We had some really great turnouts and really good transformation also. So that could be one interesting key for the future of participation in parks.
Thank you, Mikael. Jennifer, Sophia?
Sure. The thing I wanted to mention was about kind of beyond like the ladder participation that we usually think about when we look at engagement. And as many of us have already talked about, there's so few people that actually have time, energy, ability, interest to participate in coming out to public events. So kind of with that understanding and assumption, how do we actually move away from the transactional elements of public engagement that can be extractive so much of the time, and actually move towards an inclusive ecosystem and create the social and support structures, infrastructure to enable citizens to be able to meet their own needs, so that they can create their own projects, so that there's less barriers to actually achieve something, whether it be a community garden in their area or collective cooking or creating a community daycare. What are the things that people want to do? Maybe it's a policy change or related to urban planning or a park, but there's just so many wealth of things that I think community have gifts and ideas and energies to contribute, but often there's these barriers and inabilities. And right now, when there's less bumping in opportunities and more social isolation, I think it's our responsibility to kind of create those spaces and to challenge kind of the status quo, to look at what else is possible and how we support that.
Absolutely, that's great. Thank you, Sophia. Jennifer, we've got a few minutes here, so if you could unfortunately give me a quick answer.
Very quick.
Yeah.
So I'll just highlight a few things that I think are important. One's already been highlighted by the other panelists: resources. I can't do good work without resources, people and money. And so often adequate resources just are not dedicated to this type of work, good, meaningful engagement. So resources, time. So often engagement processes are rushed and they're done, as Sophia mentioned, in a very transactional, very quick way. People feel like they haven't really contributed, and that their labor hasn't been, really, or their knowledge isn't really used. So time and reflection, I think, certainly for the work we do, reflecting on location, your own sort of social location, your biases, learning about the history of Indigenous people in this country, and the truths of the land and the water, and how people, moved in this space before contact. That's really important, I think, in engagement in the Indigenous placemaking context, for sure. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you. I think the reflection piece is something that is often missed, but is such an important part. So I would like to close us there. Thank you again to all of our fantastic panelists and participants. Before we part ways, I did just want to direct you that we do have a fantastic research and resource page of our website, where you can find dozens of our other great park resources around the impact of COVID on parks and communities. All of our webinars and written resources will be up there. The third webinar in our 7-question series is next Monday, and I'm really, really excited about it. We've got some fantastic speakers that are going to chat about the equitable access to parks and green spaces. So we've got Tamika Butler from Tamika Butler Consulting, Guillermo Penalosa from 880 Cities, and Chuck Odenigbo from Future Ancestors. And it is moderated by Zara Ibrahim, who's the chair of Park People Board of Directors and the co-founder of Monumental. So Clemence is dropping both the French and English Eventbrite links for the webinar in the chat below. We also encourage you to stay in touch. So we put out a monthly newsletter to keep you up to date on upcoming events and whatnot. So please feel free to sign up for that. And we would like to thank all of our individual donors and who support our continued work. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep in touch. We're going to send today's recording and all the resources by the end of next week. And if you've got any feedback, definitely put it in that feedback survey. The English will pop up and French is in the chat link. Thank you so much for listening, for being a part of this conversation. We hope today's chat will provide some insight and inspiration into your work and the future of engagement. Thank you so much.